Testing. Testing. That's good. We'll take a minute, let everybody get to their seats. Thank y'all for being here this morning. This morning, I'm going to warn you, we're going to give you enough Jewish background in terms of the Levitical part of Judaism that'll probably make you so sick you'll say, I don't want to hear any more about this. I'm not professing that I'm a rabbi or anything like that. But this really helps out because we're at a point where we're going to look at a video here in a few minutes of a focus on Jesus when he was a rabbi. And when I saw this video, it made me go back and study some more about Jesus' early life, which we don't see a whole lot in our Bible. We see bits and pieces, and I'm going to bring you back to those after the video, but we don't get a whole lot of information in Scripture about his younger life. Now, I'm not going to make any kind of comment about why that is, because I don't know. Maybe it was not as urgent as focusing on the message that he was going to deliver when he started his ministry. But there were a few little key points that get dropped in our lap that we have to wrestle with a little bit. And it really helped me to understand, what does it take to become a rabbi? And I'm not going to give you a 2-week description of that, I promise. But I'm going to give you just the bare facts of it and try to make a little bit of sense and why I think that's important. Remember, last 2 weeks, we've been talking about these multiple groups of people that the Jews had divided themselves into, to where they had differences of opinion on a lot of key things, and they were all reading from the 5 books that we know of our Old Testament, which was called the Torah. The problem was I had when I started studying this is how could they get so different? Okay, there's some reasons why this is. Now, let me just mention 2 of them up there because they're 2 of the ones that Jesus goes after in his ministry because they have completely missed what he says the real message. And that was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, now, we said the Pharisees were very fluent in the Torah, an understanding of it, but they had really focused on a lot of ritual things that other Jewish people felt like was just over the top. Maybe they felt like that it was their interpretation of the Torah. Okay? And then we run into the Sadducees. And we make the joke about those were the ones who were sad because they didn't believe in the resurrection. Do you know the first place that we read anything about resurrection in terms of the word resurrection? Anybody know where that shows up? in the Gospels from Jesus. So how could the Pharisees believe in resurrection and the Sadducees didn't? They were way before Jesus came to earth. Let me point you to one passage, and I want you to turn to this just so you'll remember it. Go to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. He was one of the prophets. If I need to narrow it down for you, I know I don't. In chapter 12, Daniel is dealing with what he considers the ends of time. And he gets down to verse 2, where he says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. That's the NIV. That sounds like resurrection to me, doesn't you? Didn't coin it resurrection, but he said when people arise from being dead in the dirt. Now, they probably at that time argued about what body they would have and stuff like that. I really don't have any time to go into those depths today. But that's another study that we could do later on. The issue was resurrection was prevalent as an idea. And it just gave them another thing that they could disagree on. Does that make sense? Okay, now, Jesus made some comments about these sects to let everyone know that his mission was going to succeed whether these sects agreed with it or not. You get me? He was not going to let their interpretation of the law stop him from explaining that he came to what? What did he come to do? Prove the law, fulfill the law. He didn't come to abolish it. He said it right there. Okay? And here's where he goes in and starts Matthew 5, as early as Matthew 5. Okay? You remember where Matthew 5 is? It's right in the middle of Sermon on the Mount. And he's already saying, I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. We're going to explain this a little bit more, but these were the highly exalted people who knew the Torah better than anyone else. It says, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And he's trying to position what the kingdom of heaven is. Okay? Now, there's other passages that I will not go through. You can go back and look at these later. Matthew 16, he says that these Pharisees and the Sadducees are basically like yeast that you don't even see it coming on you, and it starts to change you. That their theology can make subtle changes in your life. Don't listen to them. Okay? He gets on the Pharisees for all their hypocrisy and self-righteousness. He spends a lot of time getting on the Pharisees about that. And then he gets on the Sadducees about the way that they do superficial observance of the Sabbath. And I think it was the Pharisees also, because he says, you're arguing about things that you should or should not do on the Sabbath. This came about when he was basically eating something on the Sabbath, and they said, well, you can't do that. You know, the law says you can't do that. They were looking at those things and making something out of it that was not at the core issue of what Jesus wanted to do. Okay? Now, here's the problem. All those groups, those sects up there, were all communicating their own view or interpretation of the law. The Essenes is a different group, but there's speculation that because they were separationists and went out in the desert, that they too felt like that they were the chosen people. So their interpretation was the accurate one. Now, the reason I spend so much time on this is because today we do this too. How many different denominations of Christian churches are there in the U.S.? A ton. And many of them don't agree. Okay? I'm going to try to address this later on in this class because it has hurt me since I was probably 15. I look at this and I go, I don't understand this. Why are all my friends going to these other churches and we can't seem to get together? I don't understand that. Well, we're going to go through what are some of the issues that cause that division, okay? And it's best to understand that and understand where we shouldn't be divided. And that's why I want to go through that, okay? Now, we're going to look at this video, and this is called The Rabbi. It is placed in Gamla, which is, well, I'll let you see it on the video. I don't even need to describe this. And then we're going to come back and we're going to go back into this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it takes to be a rabbi.
The ancient land of Israel is a testimony, an evidence of the greatness of what God did in that country, a testimony to the truth of the words that we find in the pages of the Bible. The hill is known as Gamla. Small groups of Jews moving back from Babylon, where they had settled during the time of the Babylonian captivity, chose to settle on the side of that hill. The northern side was too steep for people to live and too rocky. The southern side, being a little bit more of a gentle slope, was the place this community built their homes. Yet the side of the hill is so steep that the homes were literally one below the other, so that one's roof became the front yard of the house just above. To understand the people who lived in Gamla, we need to know just a bit about the various groups who lived in this part of Galilee. Living over in the northwest corner of the lake were the Pharisees, people who believed that it was most important to live in obedience to God, to keep His law. There were the Sadducees. They were involved with the temple. They taught that the way to be right with God is through the sacrifice system. They were satisfied with Rome, for the Romans left them in power, gave them a majority on the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious council, and allowed them to govern the everyday affairs of the people of the land. But the people of Gamla were different. They were the Zealots. It was people like this, whose symbol was the palm branch, that led Jesus to weep on his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, as he observed that the people misunderstood him and were asking him to be a military king. And as he weeps, he says, "If only you had known what would bring you peace, but since you missed my coming, they're going to build a wall around you, they're going to throw you and your babies against the stones, and you're going to suffer great misery." That prophecy came true here at Gamla. In 66 AD, the Jewish revolt began, led in many ways by the Zealots. 30,000 Roman soldiers surrounded this hill on the cliffs and the hillsides around. Eventually, at the breach in the wall, that V-shaped opening that's still there today, the Roman soldiers broke into the city. The defenders of the city began to flee and panic set in. 10,000 people had jammed the streets of the city, fleeing from all around to the security and the safety of Gamla. And then tragedy struck. Great panic filled the crowd pressed against the cliff, and they began to run off of the backside. More than 5,000 of them died trying to escape the Romans. More died, Josephus records, jumping off the back of the mountain, than died by the Roman swords. And the battle was lost. The Romans destroyed the city. You can still see the ruins. And it was never resettled. Visiting Gamla helps us to understand the passion people felt for their desire for freedom and the opportunity to serve God. But it also highlights that Jesus, who came to talk about freedom, who came to talk about serving God, had a very different method than these freedom fighters, the zealots. So we walked down the path, in through the city gate, and found our way to the synagogue to consider the teachings of Jesus.
Welcome to the Synagogue of Gamla. I'd like to just start by talking a little bit about this town and setting the stage for who was here and what went on here. This town was founded in 150 BC, approximately, by Jewish people coming back from the east, from Babylon. And they set up a very industrious, prosperous city here on the side of this hill. The synagogue here, you can see the size of it. It follows a fairly typical pattern, but what's interesting about this one in particular is that it's one of the earliest synagogues that's ever been found. In fact, Gutmann, the archaeologist, felt that this probably dated back even as early as 100 BC, which would make it one of the earliest synagogues ever built. And what I like about this synagogue is that it gives us an idea of what synagogues were like in Jesus' time, because it was here when he was here. And it was being used when he was here. In fact, I like to say to people that at the time Jesus walked on this earth, as we read in the Bible, there were Jewish folks who came to this synagogue and prayed to God and studied Torah and worked to understand God's will for their lives, who you will meet in heaven, because they were believers in God. They followed the same God Jesus did. Synagogue follows a typical pattern: rows of benches around the sides where people would sit, rows of columns. What we know from tradition is that the elders or the important people in a synagogue would normally sit on the benches. Indications are that they didn't divide men from women at that time. They simply mixed. There was no sense of division like that in a synagogue. And they really didn't have an organized synagogue service. And so a synagogue did not originally develop as a church, as a building for worship. It developed as a community center. People would come here for school, people would come here for meetings, people would come here for political situations, people would come here just to meet their friends, and people would come here for purposes of worship. And about at this time, about 100 BC, is for the first time when you began to see synagogues develop that in some sense have some religious content. That is, even though this is a community center, one of the central focuses of this particular synagogue was provide a place to be worshiping God and to develop this sense of keeping the law and of sacrificing yourself. I'd like to talk just a bit about the way in which Jesus participated as someone who was known as a Jewish rabbi in his culture. He came with a rabbinic style. And interestingly, he came to the synagogue, and the Bible says he visited all the towns and villages of Galilee and taught in all their synagogues. Did Jesus teach here? People, very likely he did. It doesn't make a difference, but it's just interesting to picture those Jewish folk from this community sitting on these benches and Rabbi Jesus participating. Just outside the synagogue here, you'll see a small room. And in that small room, something called a mikveh. And a mikveh is a ceremonial bath, or a baptistry, if you dare call it that. Some say our tradition of baptism comes from that. And before you came in the synagogue, you walked down in that pool and you put some of that water on yourself. And then you came into the synagogue. So there was a sense in which, as you came to God, you went through this moment of personal cleansing, personal reflection. Now, somewhere about this time in history, a tradition developed called the Seat of Moses. Now, the idea was this: the central focus of Jewish worship to God was the Torah. Why? Because the 5 books of Moses are the actual document of God's covenant between himself and the children of Israel. Now, what we've discovered, archaeologist Gutmann discovered, is over here in this synagogue, in this corner, is a closet or a chamber. And this may be the earliest example of a fixed Torah closet or an Ark of the Covenant. Up till this point, the Torah scroll was kept in a portable cart that was brought into the synagogue so that it could be read, so that people could hear that record of God's love. In this case, it appears for the first time that there is a compartment here where the Torah scroll was kept permanently. And that's, of course, a fixture in a synagogue that you would go to today. So as you entered the synagogue, eventually the person who sat in Moses' seat that particular week would take the scrolls and would come down the center of the synagogue carrying the Torah scroll, which is God's law, and then bring them to the person who sat in Moses' seat. Now, it was called Moses' seat because the person who was sitting in it got to read the words of Moses that particular week. And Jesus says to some of the Pharisees one time who were challenging him, he says, "You guys sit in Moses' seat and you don't understand what I'm saying?" In other words, you're the Torah readers in the synagogue and you don't understand? Now, in synagogues then, people would take turns sitting in Moses' seat. Any adult male could sit in Moses' seat, and it was his turn to read the appointed section from the Torah. It was all laid out on a schedule where you would read from the Torah, and then there was also a brief passage that was read from the prophets called Haftarah. It was a section of the prophets that was divided up according to a set schedule, 3 years or 1 year, so that every time during that period you've read through the whole Torah scroll. And the person who was in Moses' seat got to read the Torah scroll that particular week in place of Moses. Following that, the person could make some brief comments. People would sit around and hear the testimony and the teaching of most of the adult members of their community. They didn't have trained pastors who did all the preaching, but you'd get to sit and listen to your grandpa or your uncle or your son speak about their experience with God. And there's something really profound in that the Christian church has lost. Following that reading of the Torah and the Haftarah, then there would be a benediction done by somebody in the priestly line, and following that you would leave the synagogue and you could leave an offering, an alms offering if you chose. Now that's how a typical synagogue time of worship went, as best we can tell, about the time of Jesus Christ. Many of the passages in the Bible deal with Jesus as he was in a synagogue, and I'd like to read you just one of them, and note how incredibly God set this all up. Jesus goes back to Nazareth. It says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everybody praised him. He went up to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The section that was appointed to read was this one. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant. Everyone in the synagogue was looking at him, and he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." It's really fascinating how God arranged history and the schedule of the synagogue so that when Jesus showed up and it was his turn to sit in Moses' seat and read the Torah, the scripture passage that was on the schedule for that week was exactly who he was. I am the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah. It's me. There are a lot of evidences that Jesus was a typical rabbi in the fact that he wore the talit, or the Jewish prayer shawl. God had told the Israelites when they entered the land of Israel, when they entered Canaan, that they ought to wear tassels on the corner of their clothes. And he said, these tassels will be a reminder for you to keep all the commandments that I gave you. So they would sew tassels on the edges of all their garments. But then the time came, shortly before this synagogue was built, when they decided that instead of putting them on all the corners of their clothes, they would put them rather on a cloth like this, which they would then wear with whatever they were wearing. So they had tassels on all the time. And in typical rabbi fashion, they assign meaning to the different tassels. And I'd just like to explain this because it ties in with the tassels Jesus had and one of the stories in the Bible. Tassel has 5 knots that it's tied into, which means or stands for the 5 books of Moses, my covenant with God. There are 4 spaces between the knots, which refer to the 4 letters of God's sacred holy name, Yahweh, and the Jewish person doesn't pronounce because it's so sacred or so holy. So that means by looking at this tassel, I remember I'm in covenant with God, 5 books of Moses. I honor only Yahweh. I keep all 613 laws, and I serve the one and only God. Now, when Messiah comes, his tzitzit will have value in the fact that by touching them, they will have the power to forgive sins and to heal diseases. And so some of the Pharisees would make their tassels extra long, kind of saying, maybe I'm the one. Just notice how holy and righteous I am. Maybe it's me. And Jesus criticizes them, and he says, you make your tassels long, but it's not in your heart. You're hypocrites, you're actors. But the story in the Bible is of a woman who spent everything she had to doctors trying to prevent the bleeding disease that she had. So she comes to Jesus, and she comes up behind him, and not groveling on the ground for the hem of his garment, as we think in English, but rather she comes behind him, not wanting to disturb him, and she simply touches or grabs the tassel. Now, what you to see is that that act of grabbing the tassel was a profession of faith. She is saying, I believe you are Messiah. And she's healed. Now, she's healed not by tzitzit or talit or clothes. She's healed by God because of her faith. And that's, I think, an important ingredient. Simply highlights again that Jesus fit in. So let's just summarize. Not really so much a specific faith lesson, other than to begin to say to you, we need to think as Christians about what the method is that God chooses us to use or wants us to use as we influence and impact our culture. And the other thing is to appreciate how much we need to fit Jesus into the context of the Jewish community of which he was a part, because this is where he did his ministry. Jesus' model is to love the people whose inner hurt and brokenness leads them to do things that we would consider immoral and unacceptable. Certainly he would have us use things like media and television and music and art, and all of those things can point people to God. But ultimately our focus has to be on where people's hurts and needs and cares are and minister to them.
Okay, wasn't that fascinating? I never caught the thing about the tassel. Okay, we are going to expand a little bit of what he was talking about, because I think it will put some context in this. The title of rabbi in that day of Jesus, and even before, was known as a doctorate in divinity. That would be how we would look at it today. Someone who has studied God's law to as much as can be given one person, okay? They're well versed in the Torah. Now, the two passages I put up there, let me just tell you what those are. I won't go to them, but these are two great passages. One, Dr. Vanderline used as Jesus going into a synagogue and reading the passage from Isaiah that explained he was the one that Isaiah was talking about. Well, that would send chills in me if I had someone come read about that in here, right? But this was stepping stones to help us understand what position Jesus had in this community and what kind of impact he could have. Because if you remember, he said, I came to seek and save the lost, and he was primarily talking about the Jewish community first, and then everybody else. But who was the hardest group he had to talk to? The Jewish people, right? So, these rabbis went through extensive training. I'm going to give you a sample of that if we get time this morning, and if we don't, we'll continue this next week. But these synagogues, think about this a minute. Okay, we talked about the synagogues and how the synagogues became somewhat of a place for followers of God to meet during the times in between the captivity and on into the first century, because there was no temple. They had destroyed the temple. And the temple was known as a place of worship. Nowhere do I see where the temple was referred to as the place that they would have a Sunday school or something to teach the kids on what God's way was. They were primarily going there to praise God and to worship God. Okay, so the synagogues were built as something that would, as he said, be like a community center where those fellow believers of God could get together, and over time it developed where it became a teaching resource for the people in that community. So who would do the teaching? Well, it would be a rabbi or what we would consider an expert teacher in the law. Now, the other passage, Luke 2, if you go back and look at this, this is the other thing that just really hits me in the gut a little bit, is that we read the first instance of Jesus visiting the temple or Jerusalem with his parents, and he's age 12. And he goes in and he conducts an adult conversation about the law with the best teachers that were in his day. And it says they were amazed at what he knew. Of course, his parents got on to him and said, you scared us to death and all that kind of stuff. But he was 12 years old. Okay? Keep that in mind, because I'm going to go through a few of these pieces that have developed over time, and they were only developed by the Jewish community because they needed some written documents of some of the oral translations of what people had said or done as they looked at the Torah over a period of time. Okay? So I need you to understand that not everybody in the first century had a study Bible that had everything in one volume that they could carry around with them. We tend to forget that because for most of us, and I'm going to say all of us, there has been written copies of God's words that we can buy and take them home and meditate on. Those people didn't have those things. So they had to rely on the teachers of the law to tell them what was out there and what God expected them to do. There are two people, there's one major term that's used in Jewish communities is called the Talmud. And it was the context of two other volumes, and both of those were to capture those things that could be used by the Jewish people to do what God wanted them to do. And that was in addition to the 5 books of the Torah. Now, we had a discussion in here back, I know it was last summer, where a comment was made about they were actually talking to an individual, and that individual grew up in Jewish community and went to Jewish schools, but that person only learned from the Torah, didn't know anything about the prophets, didn't know anything that shows up in some of our Bibles today. Well, that's something we have to think about, okay? Because how could that be? Well, the community that he learned in probably decided that that's all they're going to rely on, the Torah. All those other writings that were in scrolls and, came along during time, they didn't really affect them, or they didn't think they did, okay? So the two inclusions that have been added to this thing called the Talmud is something called a Mishnah, which was a set of documents that gave guidance for anybody that was following the Jewish law, and it had sequences in there that addressed certain things that you'd run into in your community. So it was, how does the law apply to some of the things that we're going to run into in our communities? And then it also had some things in there because Mishnah is in Hebrew the same as repetition. So it was something that they could study. We like to look at verses and memorize them because they change our lives. Well, it's the same thing with them, okay? They needed to take those passages and go over them over and over and over and over. And that's how they learn those things. There's another thing that actually was created, and I put the dates on here. This is not to say that it didn't apply to Jesus' time, but it is an indication of what was being used even before Jesus' time, and then later in later centuries AD. Okay? The Mishnah didn't come around and give these designations until about AD 200. And then the Midrash was something that started a little bit later. And these were more of the views of what the Torah said about situations regarding civil law and things like that. So these were two pieces that they added to their Torah, you know, to be able to understand, how do I make this apply in my everyday life? Well, here is just a picture of the Mishnah and how it was divided up into 6 sections. And I know you can't read that, but one of those says, let me pull it up on mine. One of them is seeds. The second one is festivals. And as you would guess, this would be trying to apply the Levitical law or Moses' law to how do I deal with festivals? What festivals do I maintain? What's important, what's not important? Seeds were agricultural guidelines. Okay? Nashim was women. What is women? What's the guidance that the law says about women? Nexkin is damages. How are we supposed to deal with things? And there's some things in the law that talk about, you know, what is necessary when somebody wrongs somebody else. Okay? Then you've got the 5th one, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it's holies, which is kind of describing what they were supposed to do when they worshiped. And then the last one is purities. What makes up a pure heart in the follower of God? And so that's kind of what it focused on. So those are kind of the subjects that were grouped in those. The Midrash, I'm going to call it the Jewish commentary, because it had multiple interpreters taking their cut at what the Torah said, and it would basically give them something to look at and compare and then try to determine how they felt. This is one of the mechanisms that caused a lot of these groups to get further divided, because everything based on interpretation. Okay? And then there's a last part here that I wanted to mention, because this is something that I think is really, really important. You know, Jesus was always trying to say that you groups of Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, and you're all taking a different cut at what God wanted you to do, and your messages are all a little different. And instead of calling them out and saying that your cars run off into the ditch or your trains got off the track or whatever terminology you want to use, he was trying to say, I'm trying to provide you the guidance to get you back on track. Now, what does that cause when people try to point out to other people that there's one way to do this and other people are wrong? Well, that's what happened back then, and it's known as remnant terminology. And the kind of feeling is there's only one group of people that are God's chosen. And those chosen people are following God, and everybody else missed it. That existed back in the 1st century. Okay? I just need to let you know that, because sometimes we'll look at that and go, I can't believe that. You know, they were so close to Jesus, there's no way that they could feel that way. Dr. Vanderline has already talked about the Essenes, and then he talked about the Zealots today, and both of them thought that they were the right way to go. So this kind of stuff happened even back in those times, okay? Now, Here's another thing, a fact. Let me see how much time we got. Just a few minutes, and we'll pick back up in this discussion about rabbis. There's one big difference that I want you to understand this morning between Jesus being a rabbi and the other rabbis of his time. And I probably will have to wait until next week to show you this, but I'm going to walk you through the educational requirements that a kid had to go through growing up in a Jewish community, and what they had to learn in terms of the Torah. But when they reached a certain age, then other things happened. And that's where, actually, he mentioned an adult kid could get up and read in the synagogue. Anybody want to guess what adult age was back then? No, it actually is a little further. Nobody's going to guess it because I wouldn't have guessed it either. 15. 13 is a place where the males and the females in the rabbi school separate. And the males continue to get further education, and there's not a lot of history that talks about what females got back then. I find that offensive, but anyway. But this is the way that they taught. If an adult that was able to sit amongst other high leaders of the Talmud, he even mentioned 15 might be the earliest that you would see somebody. And then we go to Luke 2, and Jesus was 12. And it wasn't that he had reached a certain level in his school, because I'll show you what that school schedule looks like. At 12, he was so far beyond what normal students would go through in the Jewish community trying to learn the law. It's just amazing that he had that understanding. There's one other thing that I'm going to leave you with, and teachers of the law back then, if they were really, really, really sharp, they got to offer their advice or mentor one student coming out of school. And that student would follow them everywhere, and everything that the teacher would say, they would write down, they would meditate on it, they would do all this, with the thinking that one day they would be one of the so-called masters of teaching. What did Jesus do? He didn't let the student choose him. He chose the students. And in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about how miraculous that was, because he chose 12 very common people. They would not be versed in the level of a top person understanding the law. They just weren't. They might have got through what we would call elementary school, because everybody had to do that. They were, but that's not why he wanted them, right? He wanted them because they had a mission to take his message to everyone else. Pretty simple, okay? So that's the difference between a rabbi in Jesus' time and Jesus, okay? I want you to understand that difference. There's also one other term there on the bottom of that slide. It says Rabboni. Jesus was referred to as Rabboni by people in the community twice, okay? Those are the two passages that I found. That terminology, many translations just call it rabbi, some of it call teacher, some of it use the core word, which is Rabboni. Rabboni in Jewish terminology was, that's the best of the best of the best. So when Jesus said something in a group of people, and those group of people had some knowledge of the Torah or the education of a Jewish person, that person recognized Jesus as being like the world-known person that could answer any question, could tell me things that other rabbis couldn't tell me. That's how they looked at him. That's why they called him Rabboni. Okay? I think that just continues to build the case for how important Jesus was in this community at this time. Because the whole premise that I was trying to get you to understand 2 weeks ago was, why did God choose the time to bring Jesus to earth during this mess? Okay? And let's be honest. It's going to be a mess no matter when, right? We see the evidence of that now. But he chose a time because it fit how he could use that message to take that message out into the world. Okay? So, we will come back. Let me get back to the slide where we're going to come back to. I'm going to talk about a synagogue education first, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about, he said a synagogue became